socially distanced world. Just wanted to really say what good news to have 30,000 of the border staff and border-facing staff able to be immunised, hopefully starting on Saturday. If not before, there needs a real sense of urgency needs to be around the vaccinations for our border staff, but also for those who are in close contact with them, or just even the next layer outside the border staff. I'm looking forward to having the vaccine properly rolled out throughout the whole country for the 5 million people. But that is very good news. So we are obviously concerned that, as I'm sure most New Zealanders are, as to just how this particular community outbreak has occurred. And I'm looking forward to us being able to get the information once that's been established, and hopefully it will be established. But it is very important that we have clearly not only the vaccinations for the staff at the border and just outside it, as well as the rest of New Zealand, but also there is what is concerning is this concept of a voluntary recording for audit purposes of who is actually having testing at the border. That seems unusual, and it's something that Chris Bishop, our COVID-19 spokesperson, would want to speak about. Yep.
So I think the point Judith makes is the correct one, which is that I think most New Zealanders would rightly expect that there is testing at the border of our border-facing staff. There seems to have been a question as to whether or not the person at the centre of this latest outbreak should have been tested or not. The suggestion last night was that they should have been, and then it's been clarified that they're actually outside the scope of the order today. Our strong recommendation is that that order, if indeed it was outside the scope of this particular person, that order be widened so that everyone, no matter if they have contact with international airlines or airline travel, anyone working in and around the border, no matter which part of the company, they are tested. And secondly, our strong recommendation is that the auditing and monitoring of the companies, private and government, working at the border be significantly tightened up. It's very concerning that to hear from Dr Bloomfield and the Prime Minister today that essentially the system is an IT system has been made available for companies to use. That's good. This particular company chose not to use it. That's disappointing. Our suggestion is that using the system provided by the Ministry should be mandatory, and then furthermore we would suggest that the monitoring and auditing by the Ministry actually take place. And I think most New Zealanders would expect that. I heard the Prime Minister say, I think last night, what her expectation was that people would do the recording and comply with the order. Expectation is fine, but we really do need to make sure that actually takes place.
Do New Zealanders deserve to have all of our border tested for wetness?
Sorry? All of our border... Yes, I do think so. I think it's, we've just obviously had this now for about a year in our community, COVID. It is a year on, we're in our third lockdown. It is simply not acceptable for New Zealanders to be forced into lockdowns, which we have to have when we find out that not all border staff are being tested, that the auditing of who is being tested seems to be slightly voluntary. None of that is acceptable, and these are opportunities for us to learn as a country and to do better. And looking at the positive, we have some vaccines coming in for 30,000 people. Well, that's a good start, but a year on, we can't afford to have people not being properly tested.
So how wide would you make the scope around that? Because in this case it seems as though this worker wasn't deemed airside because of, I guess, where she was working, yet she was dealing with blankets, sheets, linen, napkins coming off flights. So, I mean, how far do you have to widen it with private and public companies in order to, I guess, capture everything?
Well, I think you have to take specific public health advice on exactly how you would word the widening, but I think most people would agree the widening should include the part of the company at LSG that this particular person was working on. I mean, at the end of the day, she has COVID, and presumably she was outside the scope of the original order because people thought that it would basically be impossible for her to get it, and she has. So, I think people would I think rightly think the scope of the order should include that part of the company and anyone in a similar profession and other companies working at the border, because my understanding is LSG Sky Chefs is not the only company doing this sort of behaviour.
Anyone who is dealing with anything that comes from a plane or from an MIQ facility should be within that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So how quickly should the government be acting on that?
Well, Parliament is sitting this week, and actually we are reconfirming some of the various public health orders in the House this week. So the government does have the opportunity to both reconfirm those orders, but also to potentially expand the scope of those this week.
We would be very supportive of that. And I think that, the woman at the centre of this who's had this terrible virus that she's now got and members of her family, I'm sure she would want to know too. I mean, she wants to know whether or not she's safe.
How surprised were you that things like the IT system weren't mandatory, and what kind of danger does that pose?
Well, look, frankly, I was surprised. And look, without pushing the comparison too far, it does feel a little bit like the August situation last year, where ministers had an expectation that particular things were happening when perhaps they weren't. And I think we're in a similar or analogous situation here, where I suspect people assumed that there was monitoring and checking going on of border-facing workers, and that the testing was firstly being done, and also that we were checking that the testing was being done. And actually, as it transpires, and it's taken, unfortunately, another case of community transmission for us to discover that, yes, there was an IT system, but it was voluntary to participate, and unfortunately LSG Sky Chefs didn't participate, and so it was a voluntary system, and also the Ministry of Health hadn't been doing any monitoring and auditing of exactly what was going on.
Is the government expecting too much of business, and is it being too trusting of business that they'll simply comply if someone says something, not if it's mandated?
I think it's a bit like asking people to voluntarily pay tax rather than having a requirement for it, or voluntarily keep the speed limit with no bad outcomes on it. You've got to actually, as a government, take a stance. Either it's serious or it's not serious. And actually, ultimately, we have a situation where a third of New Zealand is now in lockdown. 3 people have got this awful virus, maybe others, and we're talking about whether or not people who should be testing their staff and whether or not they should be filling out an online form to say that they have tested their staff. I don't think there's an issue here. It has to get done. It has to get done properly. And I can't think of all the businesses and all the employees whose jobs and livelihoods are now on the line again in Auckland will be saying, I'd rather not fill out a form. Of course they'll fill out a form.
I mean, put it this way, it's compulsory to fill out tax returns. Many businesses do it online, and that's a requirement government places on many businesses. You've got to fill it all out, you've got to pay tax, and then I'll tell you what, if you don't pay, the IRD comes calling. Well, it should be no different. In fact, it's even more important when it comes to the border that you fill out the form, and the Ministry of Health in this case comes down the line and says, are you actually doing the testing?
So in that case, where is the Ministry of Health then?
Well, possibly not getting advice from people who know how to get people to do things, like the IRD. Maybe that's the issue. But I just think it is, there's no point saying, well, we're going to get the employers to do it and then having a system where they say, well, you can, as an employer, decide whether or not you fill in a form, and then saying, well, gosh, they didn't fill in the form. So that's just ridiculous. I think the thing is that the Ministry of Health it's had a year to get it right, and we're always going to find systems and parts of the system that don't always work that well. But it's pretty basic, I would have thought. If you've got auditing, do it properly.
So we've had reports previously, I think the one that Dupy and Megan Woodstead initially, and a large part of it was about the lack of communication within the Ministry of Health. So, I mean, how much of this is, I guess, an over-reliance on businesses actually ticking boxes and doing what they need to do, and whether there's actually a flow of communication Ministry of Health to actually pass on accurate information.
Well, I think that's one of the things Chris might want to talk about with the Heather Simpson and Brian Roach's report. Has anything been learnt from it?
That's right. And look, I think there are real issues to do with that. And, you know, the Brian Roach, Heather Simpson report was presented to ministers in September. That was a draft. That then sat with the minister for quite some time. I understand there was quite a lot of back and forth between people who were subject to the report and the report writers. There was a degree of back and forth that's been publicly established through the Parliament. Finally, the minister got a final report in late November, but it still took a better part of a month for that report to become public. And so, you know, you go back to September, government's been more than aware of some of the issues to do with the communication by the ministry, the effectiveness of the ministry in dealing with multiple fragmented parts of government and at the border. These problems, I suppose the point I'm making is these problems have been reasonably well known. We're now in mid-February. That's 5 to 6 months on from the first draft of the Roche-Simpson report. I think I'm being fair in saying that's more than enough time to fix some of these problems. That report was pretty damning, and I think there's real questions for government as to exactly what recommendations have been followed up on and how that implementation is going, and that's certainly something we want to get into in the House in the next couple of weeks. Sorry.
What do you as well, your thoughts on the frequency of testing as well? There's been suggestions that perhaps there should be daily saliva testing in like
Well, we've been discussing this, and it seems very much that saliva testing is one of those tools in the toolbox that should be being used. And when we're talking about private companies bringing this in, we don't understand why this isn't done more frequently in the MIQ or Managed Isolation Quarantine facilities. It seems a no-brainer to do this. And I just think it's one of those things where we can't just sort of rest on our laurels and think it's all just fine and we'll just continue. We're now in our third major lockdown in 12 months. That's actually not quite what we all expected.
Why did you make the decision to attend the Gay Out?
Well, I was always going to attend Big Gay Out, and of course I didn't know about the situation in Papatoetoe. I hadn't been told until after that.
Should the government have been that major event?
Do you know, I think that's a good question because we didn't know anything about it. And what had happened, we just were told that Jacinda Ardern had gone or hadn't been there or something. And, I just think that if the Prime Minister or if the government had any concerns about community transmission at the Big Gay Out, then they should have actually told the organisers and closed it.
So can I just ask a clarify, so you would be in support of daily saliva testing?
Yes.
Yep.
You mentioned, New Zealand or Auckland's its third major lockdown. I mean, other parts of the world have been in lockdown on and off basically the year, more on lockdown than off lockdown. Are you sort of holding New Zealand to an unrealistic standard?
Well, I guess I'm very concerned for New Zealand because we are one of the most isolated, physically isolated countries in the world. We have tremendous control over who comes into this country. And we have mechanisms in which to actually implement that. We're not subject to land borders and people sneaking over them or anything like that. But we also have a very small population. We also have a very small economy compared to other countries. And smaller economies tend to get hit harder in some ways. And we've done remarkably well considering what could have happened. But we can't just continue to, we can't rest on our laurels. We have to take these things very seriously. And the other thing, it's not just about that, it's the fact that actually every time this virus comes in and someone gets it, catches it, becomes infected, and their family members do, they end up with health effects that they never anticipated. And actually, we should think about that too. It's not impossible for us to always be seeking to do better. And actually, after a year of it, I think we can do better on a few things, particularly as the technologies are improving.
The end of the last lockdown set off the chain of events that essentially led to the political management at the end of the last lockdown, sorry, the first lockdown, I should say, set off the chain of events that led to Simon Bridges, which Tom was mentioning, because there was a sense that from the public that he did
I think it's really important. Obviously we're not in an election year, so it's slightly different, and we've now into our third lockdown. I just think it's always really important that where we can support the government on what we think they're doing well, we should absolutely do that. And that's why, I started off today saying it's really good news that we've got enough vaccines apparently coming in right now for 30,000 of our frontline staff on the border in MIQ. That's great, and we need to do better with these other things. But part of being a good opposition is also pointing out where there could be improvements and actually holding a government to account. And in a democracy, that is utterly crucial. And so you'll always see us giving praise where it's due and helpful suggestions and occasionally criticism where it's due to. Did I what? Well, I'm happy to tell you, I've actually been on media already today saying that we were not sure that was necessary right at this stage. It might become necessary, but right at this stage, we thought we've got question time this week. We've got select committees are still meeting. While that's still happening, it may not be needed. But look, we're keeping an open mind. You're in the committee.
Yeah, but Judith has neatly summarised the position. The Minister of Health, the Minister of COVID Response, formerly the Minister of Health, Mr Hipkins, has indicated he's very happy to brief a select committee this week, and so I've requested that he appear before the Health Committee, which meets on Wednesday, to discuss the events of the last couple of weeks and some wider matters as well. And I hope that will be favourably received. We'll wait and see.
The government said they'll be waiting 72 hours before looking at any additional financial support. Is that good enough, or what do you think?
Well, I think that they're probably trying to see whether or not the lockdown continues. I mean, if the lockdown's for a couple of days, that's tough enough for people in the hospitality sector, butchers, people like that. It's going to be tough enough for them. But I think a couple of days is probably okay for most people. But if it goes on much more than a week, I think that we're going to have to be encouraging them to do the right thing by those small businesses.